What's up, guys? Happy Wednesday on a Thursday, as Bob always says. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of the Bayou Blitz podcast, and thanks for, working your schedules around our schedules. I'm Brendan Boylan alongside Bob Rose. If you don't already know, Bob has been under the weather this week. I'm sure you'll hear it as he begins to talk. I was in San Antonio, Texas for less than 24 hours, so I got back home. I don't know, maybe 3 hours ago. So couldn't do a podcast last night as I was flying in, and you guys know how the travel arrangements work. But the Saints were just as busy as we were over the last couple days. They've been making moves left and right. We're going to be talking about all of it. Players, in terms of new players, in terms of players coming back, in terms of reworking contracts, because that's what the Saints are good at every offseason, and making some base salaries like $1 million that have no business being $1 million. But they had a big day yesterday. And with that, Bob Rose, how are you feeling? Not only about the Saints offseason, but how are you feeling in terms of your health and what have you?
Folks, welcome to March Madness, and that's not only the NCAA basketball tournament, which has a lot of you glued to your TV sets, I'm sure. But if you're a football fan, March Madness also includes NFL free agency, and it has been quite a few years that I can recall since the New Orleans Saints have been this active this early on in free agency. I think the Saints, and I agree with what you just said, Brendan. I think the Saints did a great job, as they usually do, about restructuring contracts. I think they pulled off three major coups, in getting Michael Thomas, Jameis Winston, and even Andrus Peat to actually take pay cuts, to play on 1-year deals this year. That avoids adding extra voidable years onto any of these three players' contracts, to cause dead money down the road, especially if they lose them, like the situation that we saw with David Onyemata. David Onyemata is going to cost the Saints almost $10 million, for them, even though he's going to be in an Atlanta Falcons uniform. But beyond that, I mean, like you said, Brendan, we've come to expect this kind of thing from Mickey Loomis as far as the in-house guys, keeping them, restructuring them, working his magic, him and Kai Harley, just to get underneath the salary cap. But then to come out on the first official day of free agency yesterday, and hit 3 home runs, like they did, to address not just areas of need, but major areas of need. I think the Saints, early on, especially if you factor in the Derek Carr signing, with the free agency moves, and you have to, I think you got to give the Saints a B plus at worst, and a mid grade A, at best, for the activity that they've had thus far.
Absolutely. I mean, you have a lot of other NFC South teams that have made lots of moves. So one right here in my backyard has made a ton of moves, not just to their coaching staff that has been applauded by the national media, but some of the signings the Carolina Panthers have made have been applauded by the national media. I want to address the big one yesterday. And when I say the big one, the one that I didn't see coming, certainly was New Orleans going and getting Jamal Williams, the former Green Bay Packer and Detroit Lion, who set the Lions' single-season rushing touchdown mark, which you guys, obviously, I know a lot of you are football historians, and you know what I'm getting at here, but you look at the Lions and you might say, oh, that record doesn't mean a whole lot because it's the Lions, but shoot, anytime you pass Barry Sanders on any list ever, it's definitely a career achievement, a career milestone. So the Saints are getting and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, just privately, Bob. I mean, in my opinion, the Saints are getting a top, 15, top 20 running back, certainly going off of last year's numbers in Jamal Williams. And why is that such a big deal? Well, we don't know what's going to happen with Alvin Kamara going into next season in terms of suspension. Also, last year, you saw how much the Saints struggled to run the football if it wasn't Alvin Kamara or Taysom Hill. And I'm sure you saw this, Bob. I'm sure a lot of you watching and listening have seen this as well. But Mike Detillier, a good friend of the show, had a quote this week talking about the Taysom Hill experiment at tight end is over. And he's going to revert back to being just a running quarterback, which, great. Think about that three-headed monster for the New Orleans Saints now with Taysom Hill, Jamal Williams. Then you get Alvin Kamara. Eno Benjamin's under contract. You guys know how much I like that kid as well. Does it leave a question mark in regards to Mark Ingram and his future in New Orleans, not just in New Orleans, but in the league as a whole? It does. But you want to talk about one that, at least for me, I was on the road, obviously. I wasn't as up to date as some other people. I didn't see that one coming, Bob. And I think that's a grade. I saw ESPN graded it a C signing. I'm sitting there scratching my head. How is that a C signing? The Saints offense has been completely revamped over the last 48 hours. And from a team that couldn't score 20 points a game to a team where, at least on paper, and Bob and I talk about this a lot, on paper, or if you were to throw this team in Madden, because I'm a video game type of guy, this is an offense that should be really fun to watch going into next season. What was your takeaways grabbing a guy like Jamal Williams, who's well-versed in playing in situations where he isn't the featured guy, but works in terms of a little bit of a Batman and Robin role with other backs?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that's what I like about Jamal Williams the most. Is that he has shown that he is unselfish enough, to be able to be an effective, a very effective complementary back. But he also has the skill set to be a featured back, either over a short term, a handful of games or whatever, or during the entire season, which was the biggest question about him. He not only led the NFL with the Lions team record 17 rushing touchdowns last year, he had almost 1,100 yards on the ground. The last time the New Orleans Saints had a 1,000-yard rusher was a guy by the name of Mark Ingram back in 2017. That's a while. And again, this is not knocking Alvin Kamara at all. I just think Jamal Williams gives this team another bona fide threat out of the backfield. And what that's going to allow the Saints to do, hopefully, is use Kamara at what he does best, and that is around the formation, getting him in space, using him more often as a receiver. Because Williams, he's a 220, 225 pound back. So he is effective and a good, tough runner between the tackles, but he also has the speed to get outside the numbers, to break a long one, if he finds the open crease. So, Brendan and I have been telling you folks for weeks. We were concerned about the defensive tackle spot, and we'll get more into that in a minute. But running back was almost as big a need, and that's not even counting the almost definite Alvin Kamara suspension. Even when Kamara was in the lineup, as you pointed out, Brendan, this offense really struggled last year because they didn't have a threat to complement him. Well, now you do. I felt all along like the Saints were going to bring in two running backs this offseason, one through free agency and one through the draft. I still believe that to be true. What surprised me about Jamal Williams is not the fact that they signed him, was that the fact that they were so aggressive so early in free agency. I thought for sure, given this team's DNA and their makeup of handling free agency over the last 5 or 6 years, I figured for sure that we would see very little activity on the open market from New Orleans, probably through or at least into the first weekend of free agency. So I give Dennis Allen, Mickey Loomis, and that front office a lot of credit. They identified who they wanted, not only with Jamal Williams, but with the two defensive tackles, and they were very aggressive in going out to get him, and they did not break the market financially to do so. They have Jamal on a 3-year contract. Quite a few incentives built in, but if you look at the yearly salary, it's a relative bargain, even for running backs. And the kid's only, I think, 27. Yeah, he'll turn 28 years old at the beginning of next month. And most importantly, he doesn't have a lot of mileage on him, because last year with Detroit was really the first year that he was the featured back all year long.
Right. Right. And I'm glad what you said there at the end about just lack of miles. That goes to prove what I had just said. And when he was in Green Bay, playing in a 2 or 3 headed monster in terms of the rushing attack, and in Detroit as well for a little bit, wasn't that featured guy. And you brought it up with Alvin. Just the Saints didn't really have anything on the ground last year, especially the latter parts of the year. Um, that includes Taysom Hill. That includes David Johnson, Benjamin, those type of guys. And I think a lot of that was when Kamara has been the most effective throughout his career, he's had a running mate. You and I both agree on this, and I don't think either of us have a problem with me saying this, was Latavius Murray was a super underrated piece of the Saints offense. Yes, he was a guy that it seemed every time he carried the ball, he was one broken tackle away from breaking it. I felt that every time he carried the ball. But he was a guy that, because he was going to go get you 3 to 4 yards every time he touched the ball, it allowed the Saints to move Alvin Kamara around, which Bob alluded to. Look at last year. The Saints weren't able to do that. And yes, you can put some blame. You can put more than 50% of the blame on Pete Carmichael for not at least trying. But because of the lack of depth there, they couldn't move him out. They couldn't really put him in a situation to allow him to thrive like we'd seen in the years past. And yes, I love Mark Ingram as much as the next person. He will go down, at least in my book, as one of the top 2 running backs in team history. But we definitely saw a decline the last 2 years in Ingram. While it was great to get him back, while it was great for the fan base, while it was great for Alvin Kamara, at least in the locker room, to have his guy back, the effectiveness wasn't there from the original boom and zoom era. So for Kamara to get another guy that's going to be able to pound it in between the tackles, a guy that's going to be effective and allow, I'd be careful how I say this, allow Pete Carmichael the opportunity to use Alvin Kamara the correct way. I think that's huge. I think that was the biggest concern for me going into free agency, was how are the Saints going to address this? And you and I had kind of talked about it too. Like, we wouldn't mind bringing Mark back, but we also knew that would be a mentor role. And you didn't want to put a ton of pressure on a young guy like, Benjamin. You didn't want to bring a guy like David Johnson back, because very similar to Mark, you're kind of kicking the tires there for maybe another decent year. So I think the Saints hit a home run there. Very happy with the signing. And the other thing too is, you guys can go back and look on Lions social media, Lions Twitter. He brings quite the personality with him as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to suit that locker room very, very well. Let's move on to those defensive tackles you were talking about. You want to talk about a tough day? I guess that was on Tuesday for New Orleans in the defensive tackle position. Onyemata and Shai Tuttle, to division rivals on the same day. And Onyemata wasn't himself last year. He had moments where it looked like he was getting back into gear, but certainly wasn't the David Onyemata that signed that monster extension a few years ago. And Shai Tuttle, and I told some of my friends here in Carolina that were asking about him, what I thought of Shai Tuttle. I said, I really enjoy Shai Tuttle. I think he's a great personality, a hard worker. You guys are going to really like him here. But I don't see him being a number 1 starting quality defensive tackle. He's going to be a great piece for that rotation, but don't expect much more than that. Yes, I think the Saints lost there. I think that was a piece that you would probably like to keep, but he got out of your price range in terms of what you wanted out of the position. And I think the Saints went and got 2 quality guys. And I think there's sometimes people put too much stock in this, but anytime you bring in a player that comes from a championship pedigree type of team, I think that's a big deal too. Bob, what do you think of those defensive tackles?
I love them both. I mean, first of all, I agree with you about Tuttle. And I told my friends in the Carolina Panthers media, much of the same thing. Shai's very good against the run, but he gives you absolutely zero as a pass rusher. He's best used as a rotational lineman, rather than a guy who's going to play 45, 55, 60% of your snaps. And when we saw that happen the last 2 years with Shai, that's when the defense got into a little bit of trouble. Onyemata has not been the same since he came back from his 2021 six-game suspension. At least I think it was 6 games. And while I agree that he looked closer to the 2020 and 2019 Onyemata down the stretch last year, I don't think it was a huge loss. That the team lost him, mainly because, and I give the Saints credit for being aggressive early on. Less than 24 hours after losing both of their starting tackles last year, they go out and they get Colin Sanders from Kansas City, which is the championship pedigree you're talking about. Also, by the way, a Chiefs teammate of Tano Passanio and Tyrann Mathieu. So I think chemistry is going to be very important there. And then they got a guy that I think was a very underrated signing, Nathan Shepard from the Jets. New York had a very, very disruptive defensive line last year, and Shepard, the defensive tackle, was part of that disruption. He's, and I think it's noteworthy. Everybody knew who Saunders was, and he's a big athletic specimen. The Saints are actually paying Shepard more, not by much, but more than what they signed Saunders for. So I think that gives you an indication of how much they like both of these guys. They're both against the solid against the run. Although Shepard has had to improve in that area. But last year, if you follow PFF rankings, last year he graded out higher as a run defender than at any other point in his career. Both of these guys are over 300 pounds. Both of them very explosive off the snap. Both of them very athletic. Now, New Orleans still has some work to do on their defensive interior, but I think bringing in these two guys is a very, very, very good starting point.
The one thing that Cam Jordan kept referring to on Twitter, something he wanted, was defensive tackle for the Saints. I mean, you look at one of the mock drafts he threw together. I think he had a defensive tackle going in rounds 1, 2, and 3 to New Orleans just because. And I love that we get that type of insight to the personalities of some of these guys. Obviously, Cam has always been a guy that is very much out there and will say what's on his mind, but he definitely wanted an upgrade at that position, and I think he gets it. I think recruiting's been a big part of the New Orleans Saints offseason so far as well, and that's kind of where I want to transition. You mentioned Saunders being a teammate of Passanio, obviously Tyrann Mathieu. And we talked about that championship pedigree as well, in bringing that to a defense that was already good last year. You get some built-up chemistry amongst some guys that have played together, and you have that championship mentality because you won some together as well. I think that's a big deal. So that part of the recruiting is great. But I want to flip it a little bit back to the offense. We talked about Jamal Williams, who was a teammate of Taysom Hill. At BYU, and those guys had a really good relationship while they were there. A couple interviews have resurfaced of the two of those guys while they were in college together doing some dual interviews. And then obviously the Derek Carr. And this kind of goes to the next point, and the player that we used on our teaser images and whatnot of Michael Thomas was, go back and see what Derek Carr was talking about, saying being on the phone with Michael Thomas just makes you feel like you can do anything. And I thought that was kind of and we talked about this a little bit last week, and I believe, if anything, we threw it in the dot or drop, Michael Thomas coming back. I think I threw that your way last week. And even at this point last week, you still said, no, I don't think it's going to happen. But seeing how high Derek Carr praised Mike Thomas, and then his brother David Carr saying that Michael Thomas was a huge part of the recruiting process to get Derek there, I started raising an eyebrow and said, well, maybe this is really going to happen. And yes, guys, you loyal listeners know that Bob and I, for probably months, not even weeks at this point, probably months now. Like, yeah, Mike's not going to be back because of how they redid that contract. Maybe it's been about 2 months. At least it feels like 2 months, maybe not quite, but we didn't think he'd be back. And like I said, I heard how Derek Carr talked about it and raised an eyebrow, and the Saints go and get it done in bringing Mike Thomas back, who was a big part of bringing Derek Carr, and then Taysom Hill's a big part of Jamal Williams. And, interestingly enough, I do think that ties into what you were talking about, is the Saints have never, I don't want to say never, but in recent memory have not been very aggressive at the start of free agency. They've always been a team that sat back and waited. They've never over pursued their guys. The last couple of years, they've done a pretty good job of not overpaying for guys that they wanted. They allowed the market to kind of let those guys just kind of fall in their lap. I think the last time they really overpaid for a guy was Jairus Byrd. So that was 14, 15. So the Saints learned from their lesson.
Right.
They learned their lesson. They learned from their mistake, and they make sure not to do that anymore. But I do think that we live in a time now, and 2014, 2015 doesn't even sound like that long ago because it's really not. But we live in a time now, 8 years later, where it's a different league now. It is a completely different league. Yes, you still have rivalries. Yeah, you still have guys that want to bash each other's heads in. But we don't quite have the Johnson and Finnegan type of heated rivalries like we used to. We don't quite have that. It's so much about being buddy-buddy with people. And this is a situation where being buddy-buddy with people, I think, really helped the New Orleans Saints. And when you're able to recruit, it puts a little pressure on the front office. Hey, I've been selling you guys for the last however many months. I really need you to go get this guy. And I think we live in a time now where players have a lot more control over front office decisions, or at least have a little bit more of they could plant a little bit more of a seed, if you will, in front office's heads to go get some guys. And I see that being the case in this situation. With all that long-windedness, Bob, it goes to this question for you: does that still speak to the type of environments and the type of locker room chemistry this team has, despite not making the playoffs the last 2 years? Is New Orleans still a place people want to come play?
Yeah, Brendan, I think it is. And I think that's reflected in not only the free agents they were able to sign and how quickly they were able to do it, but also the players that they were able to keep. All of us, and you and I weren't the only ones in the Saints media. I promise you, and I've been in those press boxes too. We both know most of the Saints media. 99.99% of us assumed that Michael Thomas was going to be gone. We assumed that Andres Pete was going to be cut. We assumed that Jameis Winston was going to be cut.
Yeah, that's the big one. We hadn't even touched that one yet. That was the big
right.
one.
All of those guys are still here. Now, in Mike's case, Michael Thomas is not a New Orleans Saint if Derek Carr is not a New Orleans Saint. I'm convinced of that. But it would take more than just one person to keep Mike in New Orleans, too. I think that's the main thing that brought him back to the negotiating table and allowed him to agree to take a pay cut. And make no mistake, folks, that's what most restructures, nobody's taking a pay cut. They're just spreading money out longer. These guys, Thomas, Pete, and Winston, they took pay cuts. They reworked their deals. Now, Michael Thomas is betting on himself. He's taking a $10 million base with incentives that could earn him up to another $5 million. So, those of you that are worried that he doesn't have the heart to play, I've always thought that was foolish. It's definitely foolish to think that now, because he's literally betting $5 million. That he's going to be on that field and produce, and cash in big when he hits free agency in 2024. But I do think that it's more than just Derek Carr that keeps Michael Thomas in New Orleans. It's more than just Passanio and Tyrann Mathieu that brought Saunders to New Orleans. It's more than just one or two guys that keeps players like Cam, Ramczyk, Kamara, etc., Lattimore. It's more than just one or two guys that keeps these other guys restructuring their deals. It's still a very close locker room, and we witnessed that last year. Even when the Saints were going through a very frustrating period of time, losing streak as they were falling further and further behind in the playoff race, nobody turned on each other. Nobody pointed fingers. Everybody was the mood changed in the locker room. Yeah, you could very much tell that, but they were still very close in working in unison for a specific goal. And make no mistake, that means a ton to players when when these guys and players, as you pointed out, Brendan. Players are just as much a part of the recruiting process of free agents as coaches, if not more so, because these guys talk to each other in pregame. These guys talk to each other in postgame. They text. They speak to each other at Pro Bowls. So word gets out if such and such is not a good organization. Word gets out if such and such is a good place to play, if it has a good fan base, if it has good facilities, if it's just generally a good, solid locker room to be in. And money is what drives a lot of these guys at the end of the day. But if you're talking a close comparison, dollar to dollar wise, between the New Orleans Saints and Team B, a good locker room, a good team chemistry, and a focused front office is going to make all the difference in the world to bring players in. And I think that we definitely saw that during Sean Payton's years. But I think that that's one of the things that have continued on from the Payton era.
And just to echo what you just said, and guys, I definitely want you to hear and listen to this. I won't throw his name out there, but a guy that I know that played in the NFL for about 6 seasons, if you include the practice squad years, played across 4 different franchises. And some of his most successful years came with one franchise, while some other years he played for more storied franchises, bigger franchises, if you will. But even now, the guy's, I think, he's going on 8 or 9 years retired now. References, and I guess this is a little bit of a giveaway, but there's been so many players that have played across the league. If you guys figure it out, good for you. He still references the Baltimore Ravens as the best organization he ever played for. And Bob's talking about current players talking, former players talk too. Guys in the NFLPA talk, right? They all talk. They will all reference, hey, I played for this team and this ownership, and they're still there, and they stunk while I was there, and this and that. Or they'll go on the other side and say, for example, this gentleman saying, hey, the Baltimore Ravens treated me great. They still treat me great. To this day, they're the only organization that I played for that will call, reach out, leave tickets, do this, do that. That stuff gets around too. And the fact that, and Bob talked about Jim, and pointed to the jersey behind him. The fact that you have guys that still talk about how great the fan base was in New Orleans. Jim talked about that with us last week. He talked about how Derek
the jersey behind you, Delvin. He talks about it. Every time we talk to him
about how much he loved being there. And despite the differences that Delvin had and the issues that Delvin had with the franchise, the fact that you still have guys represent and rep these organizations the way that they do, and specifically in New Orleans, I think that does speak volumes about how much easier it is, if you will, to recruit somebody to New Orleans. And I love what Jim said last week. If you guys missed that, go back and watch it. Whether you're watching on YouTube or Twitter, Facebook, it's not that hard. Just follow one of our pages and go and check it out. But Jim talked about how Derek Carr is going to have a fresh breath of air going to New Orleans. And my favorite quote was that the fan base and the love that he's going to receive from the fan base is going to be like a big, giant, warm hug to him and his family. Jim said that last week. Go and look what Derek Carr said about Who Dat Nation since he's got there. and the thank yous he's given to Who Dat Nation for being so loving and supportive everywhere him and his family have gone. That speaks a lot to the fan base and you guys as well that are down there. To lighten the mood a little bit, not this like dark or anything, but John Butler's always good for stuff like this. John claims that he's that 0.1% that just totally knew that Thomas and Jameis and Andrews Pete would be back. Yeah, okay. Okay, I want to find John. If that's true, just send me receipts. You got us on Twitter. Just send receipts. Photoshop some bad receipt text messages, like just give me some bad photoshopped text images that you were calling it 7 months ago, and we'll talk then. I do want to talk about Jameis a little bit more, and I love Jameis. I think that is a guy that has embraced the city very well. I thought his statement on why he came back was very well spoken, or well written rather, because he didn't speak it, you wrote it. And just talked about, wanting to be here, feeling called to be in New Orleans, and all the great things that have happened while he's been in New Orleans. So at least for one more year, he's going to be a New Orleans Saint. With all that, you and I went on record multiple times last year saying Jameis just isn't, he's not a guy. He's not a Dennis Allen guy. Right. And you can go on you can go to any franchise and you can say, oh, if a new head coach comes in, that's not a so-and-so guy. Mm-hmm. We do that in football. We do that in basketball. We do that in any sport. Now, just kind of putting you on the spot, Bob. Do you still think that Jameis Winston is not a Dennis Allen guy? And this is why I'm asking you this question. You look at what Jameis signed for. You talked about the pay cut. And thank you so much for bringing that up for the people that didn't know that was a complete pay cut. That wasn't let me add voidable years. Like, he took less money to come back. You look at the contract he signed, and you look at the contract that Andy Dalton is reportedly signing with the Carolina Panthers. Do you think that factored into the decision to bring Jameis back so you had at least one quarterback that had any idea what was going on in the system, because the Saints didn't have any other quarterbacks, under contract outside of Jameis? Do you think that's part of the reason? And two, or do you think that Jameis and DA have a better relationship than maybe we assumed?
Well, I think it's clear that Jameis and Dennis Allen and Jameis and Pete Carmichael obviously had a better relationship, certainly than what I thought, because I'd have lost a sizable amount, if I'd have bet that Jameis Winston was not going to be in a New Orleans Saints uniform.
You and me both.
And listen, for people that are critical of that move, I got a couple things to tell you. A, there's no quarterback controversy in New Orleans. There's no quarterback competition in New Orleans. Derek Carr is your starter. Jameis Winston is your backup. Period. End of story. B, the New Orleans Saints were always, and I mean always, going to have a quarterback with starting experience to back up Derek Carr. That was never even a debate within that coaching staff or front office. It was preferable that backup was going to be someone with experience in the Saints system. Now, I thought they'd bring back Andy Dalton, or I thought maybe they'd perhaps explore the option of bringing back Teddy Bridgewater. I'll be the first to admit that although I love Jameis Winston as a person and as with his quarterback potential, I did not think it was going to be him. So I admit I was clearly wrong about the relationship being fractured between Winston, Carmichael, and Allen. However you want to split up that triangle, it's obviously better than what we thought. And C, to the people that hated the move, Jameis Winston agreed to take less money this year, a $4 million base. Now, if he could make up to $8 million in incentives. That's if he gets a chance to play, which obviously the odds are against. But his base salary is less than what Andy Dalton signed for with Carolina. It's less than what Baker Mayfield signed for with Tampa Bay. It's less than what Sam Darnold signed for in San Francisco. It's less than what Gardner Minshew is making in Indianapolis. And it's less than what Jacoby Brissett is making in Washington. So is anybody going to sit here and tell me that they would not like to have that they would like to have any of those quarterbacks that I just mentioned over Jameis Winston? Forget Andy Dalton, because I'm not, that debate is over. Brendan and I had it out with you fans all last year. So anybody else? Would you rather have Winston or Mayfield, Darnold, Brissett, Minshew? Most people, certainly me, would take Jameis Winston. And I'd especially take Jameis Winston for less money in a system which he has starting experience. That's where I sit on the Jameis Winston situation.
Well, and to add to that, I see a comment in here from DJ over on Facebook saying that Jameis had no option but to come back. And just to address that, that's not true. You know, the Saints, this is how the Saints offered it. They said, hey, here's your restructure. This is what we're going to put on the table. If you don't take it by whatever day it was, we're just going to cut you. And you can go where we'll take the cap hit, and you can go where you please.
Yeah.
And Bob,
which means, sorry to interrupt, which means Jameis Winston actually would have made more money if he let the New Orleans Saints cut him and sign somewhere else. And again, maybe he wouldn't have signed with like Tampa Bay to start. Definitely not Tampa Bay, but signed on to be a backup in Indianapolis, who reportedly had interest in him last year. San Francisco, Washington, any of those other places, I'm sure Jameis Winston would have had an opportunity to sign. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. And shoot, Sean Payton might even called up and said, hey, you know, if you want to just come and compete for our backup spot, we'd like to have you. So with that being said, Bob did a great job of naming all these quarterbacks in kind of the same tier as where Jameis is right now, that signed decent contracts to be a backup somewhere. And I'll tell you right now that out of all those quarterbacks that you named, Brissett's got starting experience, Minshew's got starting experience, Darnold's got starting experience, Baker's got starting experience. But I'm certainly taking Jameis's resume over Sam Darnold at this point. I'm going to be taking that resume over. Brissett's had some nice moments, but I'm still taking Jameis over Brissett. Minshew Mania was fun, but I'm still taking Jameis over. You guys can kind of see where I'm going with this. So it's not the case that he didn't have an option. It's not a case that nobody wanted him. There was interest there. It's just one of those things where, at the end of the day, Bob said it best. Jameis could have cashed out, you know, taken his chips, gone to the cage, cashed out, and then still went to another table, played, and got paid again. Or he could have stayed at one table and played and then decided to lose a little bit of money and then go home. That's what he did, is he decided to stay where he was at and run the gamble. So where I stand with the Jameis thing is, I mean, good for him. At the end of the day, not just in football, but in any part of your life or your career, if you feel called to be somewhere, if you just have a gut feeling, you don't have to say you feel called by someone to be there. If you have a gut feeling that you need to be where you're at or you need to go a certain place, 9 times out of 10, your gut's right. And Jameis just had a gut feeling that, hey, I got to be here for another year. And I have to applaud Derek Carr as well, because guys, yeah, quarterback locker rooms and quarterback rooms, they're tight and they're supposed to be. But when you have a guy like Jameis, who was the starter, came out and, I don't want to say even kind of, he came out and said, like, I kind of got screwed, right? He came out publicly and said, I should still be starting. And then comes back to be the backup for a guy that just signed a $100 million contract. And the guy who signed a $100 million contract goes on social media and is supportive of you coming back. I think that speaks a lot to the type of relationship in the locker room that we just talked about being so tight. So where I'm at with Jameis, good for you, man. If you're watching, you're listening, Jameis' friends, family, good for you. We're happy to have you back in New Orleans. And, you know, good luck with whatever happens. If you get to play, if you don't, I'd love to see a trick play like we saw in the playoffs in
Yeah.
2020. Like let's see what Jameis got. Let's see. John Butler. What is weird about Jameis is I want to see the guy have nothing, but I also don't want to see him on the field this year. Well, yeah, you want to see him have all the success in the world, but if he's on the field, it means Derek got hurt or something
Right.
terribly wrong. And you don't want to see your $100 million investment get hurt. And I think most Saints fans, regardless of how you feel about his play and his performance, he's an entertaining dude. He's got a great personality, and he's really embraced the city. So good for Jameis. Bob, I want to talk about this going into the remainder of free agency, because if this was us this time last year, we'd be sitting and talking more about what teams in the NFC South did that were not the Saints than we would be talking about what the Saints did. A lot of these restructures, you alluded to the guys that end up taking pay cuts. You had a lot of guys that end up getting these voidable years or base salary converted into signing bonuses, and the loopholes of just Mickey Loomis, man. I've said it every year. Mickey can do my taxes whenever he wants because he's going to get me more money than I could ever dream in finding loopholes. With all that said, you have guys like Cameron Jordan, Marshawn Lattimore, Ryan Ramczyk, I believe, as well. All these guys are on like $1 million base cap hits for going into next season. For the people at home that don't take super advanced math courses and super advanced, maybe even legal courses, the way that they work these loopholes, I don't know. Explain how the Saints have been able to do this so successfully over the years. And we talked about this with Jim last week. It's almost like the Saints are pushing their debt back year in and year out. Explain how that process works and how that affects the Saints' immediate future going into next season and maybe the next 5 years.
And I'll put it as simply as I can because it is difficult for anybody to understand, especially someone with my limited intelligence. But what they basically do, they'll take a player's yearly average, whatever their average is, once you take out the guaranteed money, and then you can convert a certain percentage over to a signing bonus, which in that case wouldn't necessarily affect your cap. You could take another percentage, and what Mickey Loomis and Kai Harley had been doing, you could take another percentage of that yearly salary and add it on to the end of the deal. In other words, add on a year that doesn't exist on the contract. And what that does, as Jim alluded to last week, is you and I have teased. Nick Underhill talks about it on New Orleans Football. John Hendricks alludes to it in his articles as well. That is literally pushing your debt down the road, and the negative way that it could affect a team. We saw it with Drew Brees. The Saints continued to pay Drew Brees 2 years after he retired because of those kind of restructures. Pushing a base percentage onto 1 year, and then pushing the next year, adding another voidable year on. I mentioned earlier that the Saints will be paying David Onyemata about $9.5 million. Or David Onyemata will count about $9.5 million of dead salary cap money, in 2023. And that's actually why I thought the Saints would push hard to re-sign him, because Onyemata was one of those players that agreed to a restructured deal a couple of times, and 2023 was one of those voidable years. A year on the contract where the guy is getting paid, but the contractual agreement to play on the field doesn't necessarily exist. And that's where you run into trouble with a guy like, and they're going to run into it with Pete. Andrus Peat, by my calculations, has two voidable. He'll be a free agent finally at the end of this year. but he has 2 voidable years added onto his deal. Cam Jordan, I think, has 3 years on the end of his deal, which expires in 2025. Now, Cam might still play at that point, and in which case it's hard to envision him in a different uniform other than a Saints uniform. But if he doesn't, if Cam Jordan hangs up his cleats or decides to finish his career with another team in 2 years, the Saints are still on the hook for a certain percentage of his salary for 3 years. So it's easier to do that when you've just signed a guy to a contract extension, like they did with Eric McCoy last year. McCoy was one of the guys that accepted a restructure and added a voidable year onto his deal. But with an older guy, or a guy that you're not so sure you're going to sign to another contract when the current one is up, that's where you can run into to some trouble, and create yourself a little bit of a salary cap mess, depending on how many players you do that to. The national media, especially, I think they assume that the Saints do that to everybody. People that don't understand the cap, even at a baseline, with a baseline understanding, that's why they get so angry at the Saints year after year. Oh, yeah, we don't have enough money to do this. We don't have enough money to do it. Yeah, they do. But it depends how they want to shuffle that money around. And that's where you have to be very selective, if you're a general manager or financial advisor like Kai Harley is.
There you have it. Easiest way to describe what's been going on in the New Orleans Saints world of restructuring that happens every year. Bob, it doesn't happen with every player, but it certainly happens every year. Every year there's some sort of restructure, at least for the last decade or so. There's been restructures almost every year. Prolonging the window might be an overused term, but that's where the Saints are at. They're trying to prolong the window of winning opportunities, whether it's winning a division, winning a conference, winning a Super Bowl. They're trying to prolong that as long as they can. And when it's all said and done, the Saints are definitely going to pay for it. In terms of not being able to be active in free agency, having to rely very heavily on rookie contracts. And that may result in a bad year or two, or it may result in some years where you're better than you think you would. And you kind of have to moneyball it, and try to find quality talent for cheap, which the Saints have also been very, very good at. I want to play a little bit of Dot or Drop before we hang it up for the day. But before we do that, I want to ask you one question. A guy that you and I were really high on going into last year. He had injuries. There was some drama. There was some social media posting and whatnot. And that's Deontay Hardy, who just signed with the Buffalo Bills. Is that correct?
Yes.
Looking back on the Hardy situation, if Shaheed did not have the type of breakout year that he had last year, do you think Hardy would be back, or do you think enough damage was done to where he was going to be out the door either way?
I don't know how Deontay Hardy felt about the New Orleans Saints specifically. So without being able to speak on that part, yes, I do believe that if the emergence of Shaheed wouldn't have happened, based off of the contract that Deontay Hardy did sign with the Buffalo Bills, which was somewhat reasonable, I do think that the New Orleans Saints would have tried to re-sign him, at that level of a deal, because of what Deontay could do on the field. Certainly his explosiveness as a returner, but his ability as a route runner, which, as you and I and many other people have pointed out, the more snaps he got at receiver, that's when the injuries started to catch up with him. Because he is built pretty slight, has a pretty slight build for an NFL wide receiver. But yeah, I think the Saints would have taken that risk because of the ability and the explosiveness that Hardy adds onto the field. But as soon as Shaheed emerged, I think all of us realized at that point Deontay Hardy's days in New Orleans, regardless of what the relationship is or is not, because we don't really, we can't really speak on that. But I think talent on the football field notwithstanding, Shaheed can do all the same things Hardy can do. Only he doesn't. He's a better receiver. He's not as good a returner, but he's a better receiver. So I think because of that, Hardy's days were numbered as soon as Shaheed started to emerge.
Yeah, and I will say this, and you guys can keep the receipts on this. I think Hardy is going to have a great time and a really good year if he's able to stay healthy at receiver when you pair him up with a guy as creative as Josh Allen. I really do. I'm not saying he's going to be like a Pro Bowl caliber guy, but in terms of when you're watching Red Zone, right, and you flip it on and it's like, oh, Josh Allen, 50-yard touchdown pass to Deontay Hardy, or when you're getting mad because whichever Bills receiver you have in fantasy didn't score, but it was Deontay Hardy, you're going to look back at this and say, you know what, that Brendan guy, he was right. I just think it's a good situation for both parties. And I hope him the best because he is a lot of fun to watch when he's healthy. Let's play some dot or drop these last 5 minutes of the show. And I want to start with our friend Brian Russell, who throws it in here. Dot or drop, Peyton Turner officially a bust. Coming out swinging heavy. Thanks, Brian. I didn't have to come up with that one myself, so I appreciate it.
You want to answer first, or you want me to take it?
I'll answer first. Yeah. No, I don't. I don't think he's a bust yet. And this is why. I think in modern culture, sports culture, that is, football, a lot of basketball, lots of basketball people are like this too. Players get given up on so very damn quick. And it's ridiculous. It really is. Yes, when you draft a guy in the first round, you have levels of expectations for that player. But at the same time, I think people forget that when these guys are coming out of college, they're 21, say 21, 22 years old. And they forget what it was like to be 21 and 22 themselves and just trying to figure out life in the world. And then on top of that, it's like, hey, you have ridiculous expectations because you were a first-round pick. We also expect you to now understand how to manage millions of dollars, move to a new city, and perform extremely well in a system that you may or may not have ever played in your life. Now, with that said, Peyton Turner has been bit very bad with the injury bug. I also say that this is going to be a huge year for him. Saints could not afford to keep Davenport. I'm a little shocked that he got $13 million a year. We haven't even talked about that. I'm a little surprised it was that high for a guy who recorded like half a sack last year. I know that there's promise and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So just a little surprised for a guy who hasn't stayed healthy and had a miserable season last year, for someone to take that type of a risk. With that said, it is Peyton Turner's job. It is going to be his job.
I'll drop that too. Peyton Turner is not a bust yet. He's that close. He is that close. And I compare. A lot of people want to compare Peyton Turner to Marcus Davenport. I think that's an unfair comparison. Davenport struggled with injuries and availability, but when he was on the field, except for last year, up until last year, he was a difference maker. Peyton Turner, he has struggled with injuries too, so I understand that part of the comparison. But the concerning thing with Peyton Turner is there were, I think, 5 or 6 games last year where he was a healthy scratch.
Yep.
That's what makes you really sit back and say, okay, what's going on? But the reason I say he's not a bust is because, again, he's at 2 years in the league. When Cesar Ruiz finished year 2, everybody, and I mean everybody, myself included, were ready to absolutely lynch him. And Cesar Ruiz ended up, if you were to poll, Cesar Ruiz was one of the top 10 New Orleans Saints in 2022.
Easy.
Some might even put him in the top 5. That's what kind of improvement that we saw out of Ruiz. Are we going to see that kind of improvement out of Peyton Turner? Let's hope so. Because unless the Saints go out and draft an edge rusher, which I acknowledge is a possibility, we'll have plenty of time to discuss draft routes. Turner and Davenport both were losing snaps to Carl Granderson last year. The Saints thought highly enough, and I think it was a great move to re-sign Passanio to a 2-year deal. But neither of those guys, Granderson or Passanio, have the first-round pedigree that Peyton Turner comes with. You invest a first-round pick in a guy that you think is going to be a difference maker. So year 3 is going to be the key for Peyton Turner. So no, he's not a bust yet, but he's that close.
Yeah, I get it. I do. I hope it works out for him. I really do. But I also remember draft day being shocked he was a first-round pick. That was a tough one. All right, dot or drop. Saints still need to address receiver in the offseason despite Michael Thomas's contract restructure.
Dot. I do think they have to address the receiver position, and I think that they will. No, folks, it's not going to be Odell Beckham Jr.
See how much money he was looking for?
Yeah, but I mean, remember, before the draft last year, Jarvis Landry was reportedly looking for that kind of money too.
That's true.
Unlike Landry, I think Beckham gets close to that from someone, but it won't be New Orleans. As much as I love Hunter Renfrow, and I really, really do, I can't see the Saints trading for him. We don't know what the Raiders are asking if they are indeed shopping him. We don't know what the Raiders are asking for in draft pick compensation. But B, Hunter Renfrow is a $13.2 million salary cap hit in 2023. That's why I don't think Renfrow would be a great fit. He obviously has a great relationship with Carr. Given the weapons they already have at wideout, that's why I don't think it happens. Same with Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen will probably pull in. Adam Thielen will be a great fit, and I've always been a Thielen fan. If they go the free agent route, it's not going to be a speedster, but look for maybe a guy like Matt Collins, who also has a lot of very familiar with Derek Carr. Maybe a guy like Scotty Miller, a slot guy. If they go the route in the draft, unless Quentin Johnson inexplicably drops to 29 from TCU, or the big kid from Ohio State, those are the 2 first-round picks that will receiver for sure. I know all kinds of mocks want to have the Saints drafting Zay Flowers. No, not in the first round anyway. If the Saints draft a receiver in the first 2 days, I'm specifically looking at round 2 or 3, it's going to be a bigger, physical guy. Maybe if a guy like Cedric Tillman drops to the 2nd or 3rd round. I love Bryce Ford Wheaton from West Virginia. Rakeem Jarrett from Maryland, I'm a big fan of. Same with Parker Washington at Penn State. So, no, I don't think the Saints are done adding receivers, but it's not going to be a big, huge name, and it's not going to be a deep guy. It's going to be a guy that's going to provide an intermediate weapon and be a bona fide threat out of the slot.
Sticking with receivers, this coming from John Butler, dot or drop. The Saints have at least 5 players with at least 500 yards receiving in 2023. They had 2 in 2022.
You want to go first?
I'm going to say drop. And this is why. I think that the big one for me is going to be Alvin Kamara. I think Alvin Kamara can get 500 receiving yards in his sleep with a full season. Right? With a full season with a competent quarterback and a competent offense, yeah, I think he can do that. I don't think he can do that in like 12. And we're looking at him playing 12, 10. We don't really know how many games. So I think Kamara immediately comes off that board as like a safe pick there. And then you look at the rest of it. Obviously, the Saints are not done at receiver. The Saints aren't done at tight end either. At least I don't think they are. So that leaves me Mike Thomas, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, Traquan Smith are my 4 receivers because they didn't tender Marquez Callaway. And that doesn't mean he doesn't come back, but even then, I'm not putting Callaway as a guy who can get 500 yards. I'm not getting Traquan 500 yards. So that leaves me 3 guys at receiver that I'm like 2 of those guys, yeah, they're going to get 500 yards if they stay healthy. Rashid Shaheed, maybe. Depends how they use him in the offense. And then I'm not confident of anybody in the backfield to get 500. And Jawan could at tight end. So maybe 4. Like I have 3 or 4 that I'm fairly confident, but missing Alvin as that 5th. That's why I'm going to say drop.
Yeah, I'll drop it too, for the same reasons. Again, health permitting. Olave, Michael Thomas, they're locks. I mean, they're 1,000-yard guys. A Kamara with a full season, or even like a 14 or 15 game season, not only 500 yards. Again, he has the ability of a 1,000-yard receiver, but that I don't think that's going to happen. So Thomas, Olave easily. I do think Shaheed. Unless they pick up a third guy that surpasses Shaheed on the depth chart. So, Shaheed or name player to be named later. That gives us 3. Jawan, I could see having over 500 unless they add another pass receiving tight end, either through free agency or the draft. And I'm like you, I think they will add a tight end. If it's a primary receiving tight end, then that changes the story. If not, then I think Jawan could have a big year. But I agree with you. I can't see 5, not in this offense, not with a very conservative Dennis Allen as head coach. I know he doesn't call the offensive plays, but he oversees everything. So, yeah, I'll drop it. I say 3 to 4 guys over 500, maybe 2 guys over 1,000, but I can't see 5 guys over 500.
Yeah, I'm about the same spot. Bob, I'll let you have the special honors. Final dot or drop. But you asked the question.
Okay. Dot or drop. The New Orleans Saints draft a defensive tackle in the first round.
Ooh. If you would say defensive line, I'd probably say dot. But because it's very specifically defensive tackle, and I think that's a really weird spot at 29 where you're either going to be reaching for a guy or somebody fell in your lap. I'm going to say drop. I think defensive line in general is just a need, whether you're talking about tackle, whether you're talking about edge. And I could see the Saints go get an edge. I know the kid from Clemson's been mocked a lot to New Orleans. Some close friends of mine that spend a lot of time down there say that they would steer clear of him in the first round, which I thought was interesting.
At Murphy, right?
Yeah, and honestly, here's the thing, and this is the inside scoop that I have on Murphy, and this is just going strictly off of a guy, a source, if you will, that, like I said, spends a lot of time down there. He said it reminds him a lot of Stephon Anthony, where you have a guy who is uber athletic, is the most athletically gifted player on the field year in and year out, but just cannot wrap his mind around how a defense works. It's one of those guys that dominates high school, dominates college, and then eventually everybody gets as athletic as you are. And at that point, it's about being able to make the read at the right time, understand assignments, understand defenses, and he just doesn't think at this point that Murphy's shown enough to warrant a first-round draft pick in the NFL because he hasn't seen that. And remember, Stephon Anthony, late first round, uber athletic, could never wrap his mind around it. And with that said, yes, Stephon Anthony's a bust, but he's also a guy that had like 150 tackles in a season, and his athleticism made up for certain aspects. But then there were other aspects where you're like, yeah, no, this isn't going to work.
Yeah.
And that's the knock on Murphy. I could see the Saints go try to get a guy like that. But defensive tackle, this is a super deep draft. Defensive tackle is one of those spots where it's just not as deep as some of those other positions, and some of those other positions are pretty stacked. I'm a little iffy at 29 because I think it's going to happen like this. All those guys that probably warrant a first round pick already gone. And then you're going to have a lot of guys that have second round grades where you don't know if you have enough faith to overdraft on them. So I'll say drop.
That's fair. And it's interesting what you said about Murray. I've not watched a lot of his tape yet. I do see the athleticism for sure, but everything that you just said about Murray, that's what, because I have watched tape on a lot of defensive tackles so far, and have since the beginning of the offseason, actually. That's what I see from Murphy's Clemson teammate, Barisi. Super athletic guy, can do it all, but where's the production? It's not there. I'm talking about Barisi now. He disappears in big games. Things like that. And that's a defensive tackle that's a first round prospect that a lot of people have also had mocked to the Saints. I still consider this a position of need. And I agree with you about drop. To specify first round pick, I think it's difficult. A lot depends on the draft board, between now and then, and obviously that night. But you mentioned, I will disagree with you about the depth of the defensive tackles in this draft. Love the depth. Let's throw Jalen Carter out, because I mean, despite even with his problems, he's going to be a high first round pick. Mention Breesy. You're talking Eka from Baylor, Smith from Michigan, Cansey from Pitt. Those are all going to be guys that go anywhere from pick 20 in the first round to midway through the second. So I do believe the Saints still address defensive tackle fairly early in the draft, but I agree with you. I wouldn't lock myself into that's going to be their first round pick.
I'm more willing to say they use 40, right? Like the second round pick, early second round pick. I'd be more willing to bet that the Saints use on a defensive tackle than I am pick 29. Personal preference.
Do you think, and I know we got to close out in a minute, my voice is coming and going, folks, so thanks for bearing with me. Do you think edge rusher is a legitimate need or just a luxury at this point?
With what we said about Peyton Turner, you're in an odd spot. I think that, personally, I think it's more of a luxury, but I think if they go get a defensive end or an edge rusher in the second round, or if they package some picks and come in the back end of the second round, or you maybe even get a guy in the third round, I think that speaks a lot to your faith and where you stand on Peyton Turner. Personally, from an outsider, not being in the front office or the locker rooms or understanding what this coaching staff really thinks of Peyton Turner, I think it's a luxury. But if you have legitimate concerns on the production of Peyton Turner, his health, just where he stands from a physical standpoint through 2 years, and you draft a guy, I don't think it's out of the question. I just think that it's going to say more about where you stand with a guy you drafted in the first round 2 years ago than anything. So no, I don't think it's a luxury, or I do think it's a luxury. I don't think it's an absolute dire need. There are other positions that you have to address first, unless you're really ready to hang it up on Peyton Turner.
Fair.
Well, guys, that was fun. I think we got everything in. There was a lot the Saints did the last couple days. I've really enjoyed Dot or Drop. When I'm not traveling, so like next week, hopefully, knock on wood. We'll actually put it out there on Twitter so you guys can sit there and drop some of them, and we'll be able to, prep. I also love that you guys are dropping them in the comments as well, because it makes it more fun. I mean, we want to sit here, and whether it's me asking the question to Bob and putting Bob in a weird spot or vice versa, I mean, you guys put us in weird spots. We want the tough questions. That's what we're here for. Bob, where can everybody follow you online? You've been busy this week writing these articles. I found out some of the news because I was on planes, and as soon as I had Wi-Fi access, it was, what's Bob been writing? So Bob broke the news to me without even realizing it a little bit this week. Where can everybody keep up with all the great work you're doing in terms of the latest news? And also, you got to be starting those draft profiles coming up.
Yeah, like I said, I've watched a lot of film on running backs, defensive tackles specifically. Some safety work I've done too. But yeah, I mean, we'll get into that. Folks, thank you for being patient with us and dealing with our reschedule, this week. Thank you for dealing with my voice. This is the worst time of year, for us and the media to get sick or go down with something, because it's by far our busiest time, busier than the draft, busier than the regular season, certainly. But you can follow I'm doing the best I can. Thank you to John Hendricks, Kyle Mosley, for taking up the slack. My notebook is filling up with notes, but I haven't been quite as busy from a media aspect during the free agency frenzy. But I'll pick that back up and start throwing out draft profiles and mock drafts very, very soon too. And you can follow all that and all of us at the Saints News Network, at Saints News over on Twitter. I post all of my articles on my individual profiles, which are Bob Rose on Facebook, at Bobby R2613 on Twitter. And obviously through our Bayou Blitz Facebook page and Bayou Blitz Twitter page as well, at Bayou Blitz Pod. Thank you guys for building it up so much. This is just the tip of the iceberg for us and the Bayou Blitz this offseason. So make sure you stay tuned to that too. And like Brendan said, don't be shy with your questions. Don't be shy with your requests. This is your show. Continue to make it your show.
Yeah, you guys have done a wonderful job as of late. This is, like Bob said, this is a crazy time for anybody in media, particularly the NFL media. So make sure you're following him and John Hendricks and Kyle T. Mosley and all the great work they're doing with the Saints News Network. For myself, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BT Boylan. You saw it drop right there. You can follow me for obviously some Saints news. Going to have more with my production company. We started up, if you haven't listened yet, we started up a podcast called Thoughts of Bruin, where we talk to just kind of your average everyday people, maybe not your A-list celebrities, your B-list celebrities, even your C-list celebrities, but people in the regular everyday world that have stories and insight to share. We talk to Eric Mangum, who is the director of broadcast operations at Indiana State, on how he got his start in sports media. We got some more great stuff coming up, so make sure you check us out over there. You can find all that stuff on my Twitter page. Like Bob said, please drop questions. Tweet at me, tweet at Bob, tweet at the podcast at Bayou Blitz Pod. We want to interact with you guys as much as we can throughout the week. And then obviously when we come on the show, we want to sit here and make it a show that you guys enjoy watching, listening, however you guys consume it, because you guys have as much to do with putting this show together as Bob and I do. With that being said, we will be back next week. Saints free agency. It could be another crazy week, Bob. A lot of questions to be answered. But until then, I'm Brendan Boylan. That's Bob Rose. And we'll see you next week for another edition of the Bayou Blitz podcast. Find your peace, spread love, practice positivity. We'll see you next week. Thanks, guys.